Great to see all of you here. Let me just say, I'm going to be in Ephesians chapter 5. If you have your Bibles, you can be ready there. Ephesians chapter 5. But before I do that, I want to share a couple words of gratitude. First, I don't know how many of you know this, but I'll share a little bit about the history of what this is. It was about 5 years ago. Dennis Inman called me. I was in my office one day. He calls up and he says, let me ask you a question. What would you, he said, do you know Ken Boa? And I said, of course I know Ken Boa. I went to seminary. Everybody in seminary knows Ken Boa. And he said, well, what would you think about him coming up to Redeemer and doing a weekly Bible study? Yeah, I didn't even have to pray about that. I said, absolutely we'd do that. Well, we had lunch with Dr. Boa up at the collection shortly after that, and one thing led to another, and we have what we have. Can we thank Dennis Inman for all that he does for Momentum and Venice? And I know you know this, but it should be said, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Boa as part of the ministry here. He is not only one of the great thinkers in America, he is one of the great Christian thinkers in the world. He is very, very, as you know, very well respected in Christian academia, and it's very, very highly thought of. So we're very fortunate that he'd be here almost every week to share with you guys. I want to share with you, I don't know how I get my little slides up there. Thank you, Michael. This is the man who makes it happen. I'm going to talk to you about time. Not just time. I want to talk more specifically about your time, the time of your life. And here's the reason this topic intrigues me so much. Time, of all of the things that we manage, of all the resources that we manage in our lives, time is tricky because time is so different from all of the other resources that we manage in our lives. Let me start by sharing some distinctives about this resource that we all have called time. First, time is distinct. It's a distinctive resource because you must spend it. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. Every single moment that comes your way, you are going to spend on something. Life does not come with a pause button so you can just freeze things long enough to determine, okay, how am I going to spend these next moments of my life? No. Time is fleeting. Moments fly into our lives, and we literally, in split second many times, decide how we're going to spend every single moment. Time is not something you can save up or put on pause. You must spend it as it comes. That makes time a very tricky resource to manage. The second distinctive I wanted to share about time is that all sales are final. Here's what I mean by that. Once you spend time on something, you can't return that something for a time refund. You can't, in other words, can't put life on pause, but neither does life come with a rewind button. There are no do-overs. Once you spend the moments of time, those moments of time you will never have again. So all sales are final, making time not only tricky, but pretty high stakes. The last distinctive is you can't get more of it. Now, what I mean by this is every person in the world has exactly the same number of hours in a day, the same number of hours every week, the same number of hours every year. It does not matter if you're rich, poor, hardworking, lazy, a leader, a follower, someone who plans ahead, somebody who wings it. No matter, every single person on the face of the planet operates within the same time framework every single day. So for many reasons, this resource that we all have time. For many reasons, that resource is tricky and high stakes. So I want to share with you from Scripture some guidance about how to make the most of our time. And the Apostle Paul, I think you were in Ephesians not long ago, the Apostle Paul speaks to this in Ephesians chapter 5, beginning in verse 15. And I'll bring these on the screen here. Paul says, be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity, because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. Do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another with psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit. Sing and make music from your heart to the Lord, always giving thanks to God the Father for everything in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Paul speaks about how to make the most of every opportunity, to make the most of the time that we all have. And the first thing he says here is, don't be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. What's Paul saying here? To make the most of our time, guys, we have to know what our purpose is. If we're going to make the most of every moment that comes our way, we must make those decisions within a framework of an overarching purpose in our lives. Once upon a time, back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, we used to have VHS tapes. Y'all remember that? VHS tapes? It was revolutionary because VHS tapes gave people the opportunity, the ability to watch movies on demand in their own homes. Y'all remember this. It was just, you didn't have to go to the movie cinema anymore. You could just watch it in your home. Anybody remember who owned that industry? Blockbuster Video. Blockbuster Video owned the video rental industry. In fact, they had over, at their peak, Blockbuster Video had over 9,000 stores, had over 84,000 employees. Well, true story. Back in the early 2000s, there was a small startup called Netflix. And Netflix was struggling. And Netflix was offered, Blockbuster was offered to buy Netflix for, and I want to make sure the numbers are important, for $50 million. Blockbuster, you can buy Netflix for $50 million. And because their business models were a little different, Blockbuster turned that deal down. Okay, today, Netflix, who's the pioneer in video streaming, is worth, now get this, $275 billion with a B. Blockbuster was offered to buy it for $50 million. Today it's worth $275 billion. Anybody want to guess what Blockbuster's worth? Blockbuster, in 2010, Blockbuster filed for bankruptcy. Today there's only one remaining Blockbuster store in the world. I was reading an article several years ago about how Blockbuster lost out on such an incredible opportunity, how they missed that opportunity that could not only save their business, but propel their business forward. Here's what the article said. Blockbuster missed a golden opportunity because it thought it was in the video rental business, when in actuality, it was in the home entertainment business. Blockbuster missed out on that opportunity because it did not know what business it was in. Guys, if you don't know what business you're in, you're going to miss out on opportunities to make the most of your life. What is our purpose? What is our overarching goal in life? Isaiah 43:7. Everyone who is called by my name, whom I created for my glory, whom I formed and made. Guys, you know what your purpose is? Let me just boil it down for you. Your purpose is to show God's glory so that He may be known and praised. When we understand that overarching purpose in our lives, that makes decision-making a lot easier. We say yes when we should, and we say no when we should, when we operate understanding what our purpose is. Okay, let's go back to Ephesians chapter 5. Paul then says this, says something interesting. Do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another with psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit. Okay, what's Paul saying here? When someone gets drunk on wine, they are no longer in control of themselves. They have yielded control to something else. What Paul's saying here is, be very, very careful what you yield control of your life to. Another way to say this is, if we can control our lives when we live by priorities rather than pressures. Instead of being controlled by something outside of our control, we seize control of our lives by living by priorities rather than pressures. Okay, gentlemen, you will either live proactively based on priorities, or you will live reactively based on pressures. Just because something is urgent doesn't make it most important. Just because something urgent doesn't make it most important. There's a picture of how to do this, and it's a classic picture, so you may have heard this. One day a professor was lecturing his students on time management, how to make the most of their time. And he held up an empty glass jar, and he took some rocks and he poured rocks into that jar until no more rocks could go in. It was filled to the top. And he held up the jar filled with rocks, and he said, let me ask you a question, class. Is this jar full? And everybody agreed, yeah, the jar's full. You can't put any more rocks in. They'll just fall out if you try. And then he said, okay, you think the jar's full? And they said, yes. He reached under the table and pulled out some sand. And he poured sand into that same jar. And that sand filled in all the gaps around those rocks. And then he held the jar up again. He said, now, let me ask you again. Is the jar full? By this time, the class was catching on. And they said, probably not. You could probably fit something. And sure enough, he pulled out some water and poured water into that jar. And he set the jar down and he said, class, let me ask this. What is the lesson we learn about time management from that picture? And one eager beaver in the front row raised his hand and he said, what we learn is that no matter how full your life is, you can always fit something else in. And the professor said, no. The point of this illustration is this. If you don't put the big rocks in first, they won't go in at all. If you don't put the rocks in first, they won't get in at all. If we don't proactively prioritize the most important things in life, we will yield control to pressures, and our lives will be filled with sand and water instead of the rocks that are important. As a practical matter, Jesus role modeled this. Listen to this verse in Mark chapter 1, verse 35. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. What did Jesus do? Jesus did the best thing, first thing. One of the ways to live by priorities instead of pressures is to do the best things, first thing. I don't know about you, those of you, especially those of you who are still in business, still have jobs. For me, it's a lot easier to control when my day begins than when it ends. Once my day gets started, sometimes it's hard to know when it's going to come to a close. I have far more control over when my day begins. I will say this, you guys seem to be good at this. You're in a Bible study on Friday morning at 7 a.m. You're starting your day well. You know, I encourage people often as a means of spiritual growth to get up earlier. Not just so they can fit more in their day, but so they can do best things first thing. The final thought I'll share before we have a time of discussion around your tables. One of the keys to making the most of every opportunity, guys, is to maintain margin. Now, this is true in areas of life other than just time management. It's important to create margin. We just saw Jesus do this. Jesus, I think about the ministry of Jesus. There is so much he could have done that he didn't do. When Jesus prayed to the Father that night before he went to the cross, he said, Father, I've completed everything you gave me to do. I've done it all. I've done everything that I'm supposed to do. At the very same time he was praying that prayer, there were still people in the hospital. The very same time Jesus prayed that prayer, there were still people in the graveyard. There's so much more Jesus could have done, but he didn't do. In fact, we see Jesus, as we just read, getting away from the crowds. We saw Jesus getting away from his disciples. Jesus had margin in his life. Now, let me explain what I mean by margin. Margin is the space between your lifestyle and your limits. As it relates to time, margin is the space between how much time you spend and how much time you have. Now, especially in American culture, most people live with little to no margin. Now, why is that? One of the reasons that's true is that we have, at least in American culture, equated busyness with productivity. We are being productive if we're busy. And if we're busy, we're being productive. If I have downtime, that is wasted time because it's not productive time. The problem with, there's a huge problem, especially as we pursue our purpose. There's a big problem with living at our limits, with living with no margin. And here it is. Living at your limits transforms opportunities into crises. In other words, when an opportunity comes your way to better fulfill your life's purpose, if you're living at your limits before you can say yes to that, you've got to figure out what you're going to take off your plate. And many times that leads to a crisis. Rick Warren said it this way: for most people, the barrier to spiritual growth is not lack of commitment, but overcommitment to the wrong things. We have an assimilation ministry here at Redeemer. It's called Place, and the purpose of that ministry is to help people who are new to the church become involved in ministry to fulfill their purpose to glorify God with their lives. So it's a great ministry because we look at, we help people understand what their abilities are, what their spiritual gifts are. We help them understand their personalities and how their life experiences plays into this. By the time they finish that program, that ministry, we're able to offer to them, here's a great option for you in ministry. You could serve the kingdom, you could serve the church or other ministries in this way based on how God created you. Very, very often, we hear something like this. I'll paraphrase. Wow, I never thought of it that way, and I would love to do that, but I just don't have the time. One day when my life slows down, I may consider doing that. Listen, margin never happens accidentally. Margin never just happens. Margin is only there if you create margin. So, time management. How do we make the most of this fleeting resource called time? That's tricky and high stakes. Know your purpose. Live by priorities, not pressures. and learn how to maintain margin well. So I understand we're going to have a time of discussion around our tables now. I've prepared 4 questions. So question number 1, if you had to eliminate one daily or weekly activity, what would it be? Are there activities in your life that are disposable? What would that be? Number 2, how do you guard best things from good things? Because usually best things aren't on the altar of sacrifice of bad things. No, we sacrifice best things oftentimes because of good things. How do you guard against that? Practically in your own life. Number 3, when was the last time you had to say no? Why did you have to say no? And what made it difficult? Number 4, how well do you maintain margin, and how do you maintain margin? What practices do you have in place to guard margin in your life? It'll take a few minutes and discuss those.